Look, guys, if you haven't seen the movie, I really would urge you to go and see it. So I think I'm supposed to be wearing this, so I'm going to put it on. I don't know if it makes any difference or not. So if you haven't seen the movie, I really would urge you to go and see it. The reason it occurred to me to play a little bit of it at the start of a meeting on Marxism Religion is that I think it really portrays all of the contradictions within religion, but also demonstrates a lot of the things that Marx actually said about religion, contrary to the popular view of what Marx said about religion, which is that basically, it is just a tool that stultifies people and so on. Because one of the things that occurred to me when watching the film is that here you have this magnificent person who sang some of the big anthems of the civil rights movement, Respect, Young, Gifted and Black, and so on. Whose father was a Baptist in the church, who regularly sang to and led sermons to 4,500 people every week. Was also active in the NAACP that Aretha Franklin supported, Martin Luther King, whose group, of course, was called the Southern Christian Leadership Movement, Conference, thank you, and so on. And here you have this person singing gospel and singing about Jesus and singing about God and singing essentially about a religion that, if you think about it, was exported to Africa by missionaries, by colonialists, and so on and so forth, slave owners in the South. This was the religion of the Ku Klux Klan, for example. All of these contradictions are shown up within that clip, I think, as well as some brilliant singing. There's something else. Sorry, I'm getting befuddled by the technology here. Never mind religion befuddling people. So, the idea that religion has simply stupefied these people. Those people in that video clip were not stupefied. There were people in that video clip who had been active in the Black Power movement. You could see it in the clothes they wore, in the afros, and so on. And when they sang about struggle and suffering and so on, it wasn't my struggling and suffering is so great it's going to redeem me in the face of the Lord. It was this struggling and this suffering it should not be happening. Why am I putting up with this struggle and suffering? And there's that contradictory nature which Marx really talked about, but which is often ignored, particularly within academia, and therefore people who don't engage practically on a day-to-day level with Marxism in practice, that will be their understanding of what Marx said in Religion, really summed up by the phrase, religion is the opium of the people, as if that's all that Marx had to say. And by meaning opium, that he must have meant that it dulls people's senses. Well, there's, of course, an element of truth in that, although actually, in Marx's time, opium was also commonly used as a medicine, particularly for the poor and so on. Therefore, the idea that it could bring relief to suffering, in other words, that the reality of suffering was one of the core points about what religion expressed. And it's quite interesting, actually, that if you look at... Done that one. Okay, so this is the last sentence that everybody remembers and everybody gets told about at school, that Marx said about oppression, that it's the opium of the people, without further expression. The previous sentence explains a little bit more. It's the sigh of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. In other words, in order for religion to have any kind of traction with people, there has that the heartless world and the soulless conditions are a part of what drives people to seek some kind of solace or explanation or redemption within religion. But it's quite interesting because there's an even more important first sentence to that quote. And I googled Marx's quote on religion, wanting to find a slide that would include that first sentence, and I couldn't find one. Most of them just have this one, and even the best of them have that one. But they don't have the first sentence, which says that religion is at one and the same time the sigh or the cry, you get different interpretations, the cry of the oppressed, and a protest against that suffering. And that is the important bit that is often missed out in terms of the role that religion in terms of the role that religion can play. And I'm going to come back to that quote later on in the talk. But first, just to back up in terms of what I said, and you probably can't read all of this, I'll read a few bits of it to you, but this is taken from an A-level sociology revision website to teach you about what Marx said about religion. And so the Marxist perspective of religion, religion is the opium of the people, it justifies an unequal social order. Well, yes it can, but it can also represent a challenge to an unequal social order. We'll come to talk about that. Promise of a afterlife, something to look forward to, virtue out of suffering. Well, not always. Sometimes it's a protest against that suffering, and so on. But largely this is about false consciousness, it's about how, you know, it dupes people and so on. It talks about some evidence to support Marxism. I quite like this bit. It says the non-necessity of religion under communism, which we do agree with. Actually, we do think that in a communist society where oppression doesn't exist, that actually actually religion will wither away, which does say that there, which is great. But I like the bit where it says against the criticism that religion still exists where there is no oppression. I don't know how they found out about that. I'd like to know where they went to get their evidence for this. I'd quite like to go there. It's also interesting, actually, that it says that liberation theology represents a criticism of Marx's view on religion, whereas I would argue that the liberation theology actually vindicates Marx's view on religion, because one of the key things that Marx says, which I'll come on to talk about in a moment, is that you cannot understand religion without understanding the social and economic conditions that give rise to that religion. And because of that, because everything starts with the material world around you, not with the ideas in your head, therefore religion can take different forms and can be open to many different interpretations, including progressive ones against oppressors, even though they may sometimes be problematic in terms of how far they're prepared to go, and even though Marx did say that it was important that it was important to fight against religion, but he also understood its dual nature. He didn't really go to great lengths to say how bad religion was. Much more of his effort went towards explaining why people are religious and how we can fight for a society where without the soulless world and the heartless world and oppression and so on. And therefore much more than just a plot to befuddle the masses, which comes across here, because there is nothing here either about the contradictory nature that religion can play, or about why. Why should people just accept these ideas? Are we just all passive vessels, and if the ruling class say, put up with your suffering now and you'll get rewarded in heaven later, we'll all just accept it? Why are the ideas accepted in some time and not accepted in other times? Why is one particular religion can play quite a progressive role at some time and play a very reactionary role in another? People who see wars as simply, you'll see this view presented quite often, what Marx and Engels called an idealistic view that starts with the ideas in people's heads. But when it comes to religion, they'll say things like, oh, there's a clash of civilizations going on between Christianity and Islam, or, look what religion does in Ireland, it's just Protestants and Catholics killing each other. It doesn't explain why Protestants and Catholics don't kill each other in Liverpool, for example. So this has got a completely idealistic explanation, which is one of the key reasons, actually, why the discussion about religion matters. And I'll come to that shortly. First of all, just a few other examples of why it matters today. By the way, whoever wanted to turn this off now can turn it off, but I don't know how to do that, so otherwise it's just going to stay there. So, where's he gone? He's gone. Terry, if you want to turn it off now, you can turn it off. It might irritate everybody. I'll put the quote back up in a minute. That'll be better. So a number of reasons in terms of why religion is important at the moment. First one, Islamophobia. Okay, you cannot get away from the fact that Islamophobia has been over really the last 10, 20 years significant feature of Western society, and that therefore the attitude that revolutionaries and the left take towards Islam is very important. I'm not going to go into great detail about that because there is a meeting later on this evening on the question of Islamism, but I will touch on it, because getting it wrong means that you in effect end up siding with the in effect means that you end up siding with the oppressor. Shuffling around here because right, okay. Yeah, getting it wrong in effect means that you end up siding with the oppressor. For example, in the wars in Iran and Afghanistan, or in ganging up to demand that women remove the hijab, for example, which was a big mistake that the left made in France, that allied them really with the far right, who attacked Muslim women in the streets and Muslim women in the streets and so on. But you can also get it wrong the other way, because there are two big mistakes really that you can make around the question of Islam in particular, but religion in general. And one is to say, oh, it's really equivalent to fascism, it's really backward, we should oppose it everywhere, and so on and so forth. The other is to say these people are oppressed and therefore we can't criticise them. When it comes to the situation which has been taking place, which people will have heard about, and the protests against schools in Birmingham, which I'm going to talk about a bit more towards the end of the talk, you know, to not criticise the people who are standing outside the schools saying we don't want education that's going to turn our kids gay, actually that means collaborating with homophobia, and it's not, you know, and it would also be an incorrect position. I also think actually that as in terms of immigration and the sort of people, because we support the rights of immigrants, we will often work with immigrants, and that will also bring with it people who may have greater allegiance to churches and so on and so forth, and therefore we will recruit people into the party, not just immigrants, but you know, people who've grown up with you know, with a church background in Britain. And therefore our attitude towards people who come with religious beliefs into the party is important. So there are lots of reasons why discussion is important, but really, fundamentally I think why it's important is because of what I talked about before, and that thing about the basic tenets of Marxist philosophy, which is, do you start with the ideas in people's heads? Do we just see these battles as a result of what people think? Or do we look underneath the surface to the real social and economic conditions in which people are expressing those ideas? And that is the materialist understanding of society, which was something very unique that Marx talked about, and that distinguished Marxism at the time from other thinkers, and including other materialist thinkers. So, in order to elaborate the Marxist position a bit, I'm just going to start with a few quotes. So we're just looking at that basic idea that thought derives from the material world. That wars and revolutions and all sorts of arguments that go on aren't just about the religion and the ideas in people's heads, but we have an understanding of where those ideas come from. So I'm just going to give you a few quotes from the writings of Marx and Engels. So. From the Communist Manifesto, does it require deep insight to comprehend that people's ideas, opinions and conceptions, in a word, their consciousness, changes with every change in their life conditions, their social relations and their social being? So this is actually also an important element about the changing of ideas, because when Marx said, because ideas arise in the material world, but because human beings are always acting on the material world and changing it, in turn ideas can also change and adapt. Again, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men, and he uses the word men, which is unfortunately in common with the time, that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consequence. And finally, the last quote I want to give you. Is it? No, I think there's another one. Mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. Therefore, the production of the immediate material means of subsistence, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, form the foundation on which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must therefore be explained. So, very clearly there.
More slowly, please.
You want, okay, I'll try. Okay, I'll try. Okay. And then he's, to kind of sum it up, the foundation of irreligious criticism is man makes religion, religion does not make man. And that really is the kind of underpinning of Marx's materialism and explanation of where ideas come from. In other words, that religion has social roots, and that ideas develop and change as society changes, as human beings act on society and change society. So I'm rather briefly going to look at. By the way, he did say that that criticism of religion was necessary, but he also more or less said, and this is 200 years ago, before you get people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens who think they're being so clever because they can produce these treatises on how God doesn't exist and therefore people who are religious are stupid. Marx 200 years ago said basically we've completed the criticism of religion. We know all that. Okay, that's not the important thing. The important thing is to understand the social basis of religion and how we change the material conditions that give rise to it. So I'm going to just briefly run through how that analysis, that materialist analysis, applies to the development of some of the major religions. Because, early religions, going back before the foundation of Christianity or even Judaism into a more organised religion, wandering groups of nomads and tribes and so on always gave spiritual meaning to things that happened around them that they couldn't really understand. It might be a famine, it might have been some bad weather, it might have been some particularly good weather, it might have been a bad dream they had, it might have been what they thought was a visionary dream they had. It could have been all sorts of calamities or good things that happened, but without seemingly any explanation. And therefore people had gods that resided in mountains, or they worshipped the sun. It's not a bad idea to worship the sun. There's probably some people who'd rather be out there doing it now, but anyway. These kind of beings, animals and so on, if camels were really important to you, or cows, for example, you might invest some kind of spiritual meaning in them. So Jehovah was one of these many gods that originally dwelt on Mount Sinai. Over a period of time, this belief in many gods kind of coalesced into a monotheistic religion, where there was one god, Jehovah, who originally resided in Mount Sinai. Again, the reasons for this are quite interesting when you think about the material conditions. The fact that, for example, iron could be produced relatively cheaply and freely meant that people could make things, they could trade things, they could travel, and you could begin to form bigger, more stable dwellings, the beginnings of cities, and so on and so forth. And in that situation, the idea that there was one God actually began to make a little bit more sense. And as Jewish people spread out along trade routes, and they went into big cities, in particular they went to Rome, for example, which becomes important later on, and so on. They mixed with people from different backgrounds, and all embracing deity could seem to offer some support and protection. So you see a trend towards monotheism in all the great civilizations of antiquity, the rise of Buddhism in India and China and so on. Christianity later emerges as a version of Judaism, one of many cults, and you can argue for ages over what's true and what's not true in the Bible. There's very little evidence that the person that we think of as Jesus Christ probably did exist, but there were lots of people called Jesus. It was quite a common name, and there were lots of rebels and lots of prophets and so on. At the time, as people began to rebel not only against the occupation of the Romans in Judea, which was a kind of area around Jerusalem, but also of the Jewish people themselves that collaborated with the Romans, particularly in terms of the rich against the poor, and therefore lots of different tensions going on. And within that, some people rose up against the temples, and rose up against the temples, and so on. And I don't have time to go into this in any detail at all, but Christianity emerges eventually as a version of Judaism which takes some of the elements from Judaism. Every religion as it develops takes things from previous religions, from pagan rituals and so on, things like the virgin birth, redemption, resurrection, and so on. These all existed in previous religions, and particularly when it came to Jewish traders going around the world and finding in places like Rome, cities, the synagogues being, or the places of worship being places where they could come together, find people like them and so on, and organise together, and it helped them to organise their trade and so on and so forth. There were also people who were known as God-fearers, who weren't Jewish people, who also went to those churches. They found them quite attractive, but they didn't like things like the dietary rules, circumcision, and so on and so forth. And when Paul, it does seem to have been somebody called Paul, who may have written most of one of the Gospels, arrives in Rome, he sees the opportunity to bring together Christianity amongst some of these people, and therefore drops some of the more restrictive rules and so on, and eventually at some point the Roman Empire decides that it would be quite useful to have Christianity on its side as it spread and so on and so forth, again without the need to go into detail. But the important thing about Christianity is really the way in which, and this is true of all religions, that they are broad enough to appeal to all different parts of society. Usually, they start getting organised by people who are just below the top strata of society, who want to break through. And because of the time, the leaders of society talk a lot, and poor people talk a lot in terms of the language of religion. The language of religion is what is what becomes important. But because of its adaptability, there are massive contradictions within it which allow it to change and adapt and appeal across class lines. So you can find revolutionary messages that appeal to those rebelling against the Romans. You can also find the message diluted to appeal to those whose bitterness was combined with the fear of revolution. They also, they want to fight, but they also want to keep the masses down. As Chris Harman put it, the Christian message provided consolation for the poor. It provided a sense of their own worth to those of the better off who were just destined for humble origins, and it provided a way in which the minority of the rich who were revolted by the world around them could discharge their guilt whilst keeping their wealth. Therefore, it's summarising really the way in which Christianity could appeal to a whole number of different classes. A similar process took place around the development of Islam, but I'm not going to go into that, or I'm going to run out of time. But as I say, there's a meeting on Islamism later, and obviously if people want to ask questions about that. The important thing is about the social roots of religion. And by the way, I just want to say within that something about the question of the family and women and so on and so forth, because obviously one of the main things that's often said against religions, and particularly against Islam, is it's anti-women, it's anti-gay people, and so on and so forth. The centrality of the family actually is a feature of all of those religions. And the reason, as Marx put it, that the secret of the holy family lies in the earthly family. In other words, as religion developed, it took things from the real world around it. In the real world, particularly in a lot of the less developed countries, the role of women was quite subordinate, and the role of the family quite crucial often to the survival and so on. And therefore, the question of the family became very important. There's a whole other meeting about the development of the family, which obviously I haven't got time to go into, but this is a feature of all religions, and it arises from the real situation. It's not that the religion tells you that you must oppress women. You can actually find all sorts of different interpretations in all the main religious texts. And in actual fact, if you look now at what's happening across Europe with the rise of the far right, you often find the Catholic Church in collaboration with the far right around the slogan of defence of the family. They're beginning to come out with all this stuff around what they call gender ideology, which is an attack on people teaching in schools and universities, anything progressive about women's rights or gay rights and so on and so forth. And since you see Salvini in Italy, kissing the cross when he's talking, waving his rosary beads and so on. So this isn't something particular to the Islamic religion. and so on. So it's not a case of saying that one religion is better than the other, or that one religion is good, another one is bad, and so on. That everything has to be judged in its concrete circumstances. So on the question of Judaism, you know, you would defend the synagogues against the attacks of the far right, but you would also support the Palestinians against the religious or non-religious Jewish army captains. On the question of Catholicism, you know, if you look in the Middle Ages, and don't think I'm really going to have time to go into the Peasant War in Germany, but if you're interested in what Marx wrote about religion, reading Engels on the Peasant War in Germany is a really, really interesting thing to read, because he talks about this guy called Munzer, who was really quite revolutionary for his time, and this is, people will have heard of Luther, you know, nailing his proclamations to the walls of churches, where he was trying to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church on behalf of the emerging bourgeoisie, and so on, and the growth of Protestantism and so on. You might not have heard so much about Munzer, because Munzer wanted to take that revolution much further. And a lot of his writings are really revolutionary for their time. And okay, I won't be done. Okay, so it can be reactionary, or it can be progressive, depending on the circumstances. We talked about Christianity, Martin Luther King. You've also got the evangelical Christians of today, the anti-abortionists, and so on. And you can go through the lists. And this, of course, is true also of secular movements. That secular movements can also be progressive or reactionary. And to be honest, faced with somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who used to be on the left, then decided that he hated religion so much, and he particularly hated the Islamic religion so much, that he sides with the American ruling class in the Gulf War. You know, I'd rather have a priest from 500 years ago saying, let's rip off the heads of the rich because they don't care about the poor, than have some smug liberal academic of this century. Okay, I'm going to have to move on a little bit. So, I'd like to talk a bit more about the Peasant War, but I don't really have time, but it's definitely worth reading. Okay, why does religion exist today then? Okay, so now we've had the development of science. The church isn't really, in terms of its role in society, apart from in a few places around the world, so important. Why does religion exist today? Why does religion persist? By the way, on the question of science, people should know, for example, 270 years BC, Aristarchus made a very good measurement of the distance from the Earth to the Moon, which is still pretty much accepted today. It's not the idea there was no science in this time. Isaac Newton, who people remember as a great scientist, here's a quote from Isaac Newton: "He who thinks half-heartedly will not believe in God, but he who really thinks has to believe in God." He also believed in alchemy, that you could turn base metals into gold. In fact, he got mercury poison from trying it out and so on. What's the secret to why Marx and Engels said that religion persists into today, when we're supposed to have this nice progressive thing? And this really hinges around Marx's theory of alienation, of the way in which human beings, whilst being part of nature, are a very distinct part of nature. Hi guys, I'll start again. Are also a very distinct part of nature. And what is distinct about them is that they consciously act on the world around them in order to create their means of existence. And in order to do that, they work together and change the world at the same time. This is a unique thing about human beings. And therefore, what makes human beings human, what Marx called their species being, is that ability to labour on the world around them and produce their means of existence. And Marx talks about how what capitalism does is it takes that process, which is supposed to be what is unique to your humanity, what is unique about making you human, and it turns it into something alien, something that you have no control over. So that instead of feeling when you go to work, you know, and you think, this is great, I'm really going to express my creativity today, I'm going to think about what a wonderful thing I've produced. Instead, you really hate going to work. You know, the worst time is when you're at work and the boss is telling you what to do, and maybe you make something that you know you can never afford to buy, and so on. And there are some lovely quotes from Marx about alienation, which if I get a chance I may come back to in a summing up, because I'm going to skip a few of them. But is that idea that because your humanity is kind of taken away from you in that way, and therefore we live in an inverted world, what Marx called an inverted world. So he says, religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. And he says that, and you know, he talks about this state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they are in an inverted world. So this idea where what you produce, the act of producing what makes you human, should be what defines you and makes you feel good about yourself, becomes something that is completely alien to you and is taken over by somebody else. You know, in a sense, you bow down to the products of your labour. The market, market is this mysterious thing that happens over there. You know, the pound falls. Why does the pound fall? You know, you don't see the reality of what is going on there, and it is that alienation and suffering. That alienation that's produced by that work that makes people more open to religious ideas. I am going to finish, Chair. I know you're looking at me getting agitated. I wanted to just talk about how Lenin actually brought that up to date a little bit much later, where he said, why does religion retain its hold? And then he gives an answer that the bourgeois who likes society as it is now, but quite like it to carry on, might say. Because of the ignorance of the people, replies the bourgeois progressivist, the radical, or the bourgeois materialists. And so down with religion, and long live atheists. The dissemination of atheist views is our chief task. The Marxist says that this is not true, that it is a superficial view. It does not explain the roots of religion profoundly enough. It explains them not in a materialist, but in an idealist way. The deepest root of religion today is the socially downtrodden condition of the working masses and their apparently complete helplessness in face of the blind forces of capitalism. And I think that much more better explains why people will hold on to religious ideas. And one of the things that Marx comes back to when he talks about religion time and time again is not that there is some kind of clever argument that you can make against religion that's suddenly going to make everybody see the light. What he says is that in order to be truly free, we need to fight against the conditions that produce religion. He talks about the society that has the aroma of religion, that suffering and that alienation is the society that we need to that we need to fight against. I'm going to skip a little bit and finish with talking about the situation in the Birmingham schools, because I think that's one of the most important practical considerations. Okay, very briefly then. So, people make religion, religion doesn't make people. Religion has social and economic roots. Depending on the social and economic circumstances, religion can have reactionary or progressive elements. To be truly free, people do need to be freed from religion, but this means fighting the social conditions that gave rise to religion, specifically oppression and alienation. What does it mean in practice? I'll talk a bit in the summing up, and people might want to ask about it, about can religious people join the party? Yes, absolutely. Does Marxism ban religions? No, the Bolsheviks didn't ban religion. Actually, the Muslim religions were freer than they'd been before. After the Bolshevik Revolution, it was the rise of Stalinism is a different thing, and so on. But what I really want to finish on is how does this relate to what some of the difficult points that happen today. So people may have seen large demonstrations of Muslims outside a primary school in Birmingham, more than one actually, saying that they don't want, essentially they don't want LGBT plus inclusive education taught in their schools because it is against their religion and it's making their people gay, being gay as haram or whatever, and so on and so forth. Now, I think it's very important. Number one, let's look at the social and economic conditions behind this and what's been happening in Birmingham. This is an area where the Trojan horse scandal tried to blame Muslims for taking over schools, turning them into bastions of Sharia law and so on. There was a big Islamophobic investigation into this and it was shown to be a load of nonsense. But understandably, people felt under threat because of that, and socialists in Birmingham and across the party and a lot of the left stood behind the Muslims who were being attacked stood on principle behind with the Muslims who were being attacked in that way. What do we see in the situation of the schools now? I think you see some people seeing an opportunity to mobilise people in a way that allows them to maybe get back a little bit, to develop a bit of a, to go back on the front foot around religious-based ideas and so on. This does not represent the whole of the Muslim community in Birmingham by any means. It doesn't represent all of the parents at the school. It certainly doesn't represent the LGBT plus Muslims who do exist. I march with them at Pride and so on. But nevertheless, that is what is going on here. It would be a mistake to simply say the problem is Islam is a backward religion, because actually what starts to then happen is that people, and this has happened sometimes, start to see LGBT plus education as a way to attack Muslims. Oh look, we said you were all homophobic and so on, link it to the prevent agenda and so on. This would be a mistake. However, it is not the case that the people on the protests are holding up banners saying we're against Islamophobia and we're against prevent. If they were, great, brilliant, we'd be with them. They're holding up banners saying don't teach our kids to be gay. This is what they're holding up. Children are too young. Let children be children. Well, some of us have been here before. Actually, it was around something called Section 28 that Margaret Thatcher brought in that banned people from talking about any kind of sexual relationship other than that within marriage between a man and a woman. And that caused endless damage to a whole generation of young people who grew up in an atmosphere where they had nobody to talk to about their developing sexualities and so on, where teachers felt that they would lose their jobs if they talked about being gay. And we're not going back to that. We're not going back to that. And it is not justifiable for one oppressed group to use their oppression to attack another oppressed group. And therefore we stand with the school in wanting, and in fact we want to expand what the school does to all schools. I mean, every school should be teaching LGBT plus inclusive education, and that means that sometimes that we have to oppose the protests, and that also means sometimes arguing with people that we've worked with in the past. Some of these people will have worked with over the Stop the War coalition against the Gulf War, in Stand Up to Racism, against when we were campaigning in the European elections against Tommy Robinson and so on. Nevertheless, we have to take a principled position. And by the way, that's harder if you haven't taken a good position before. But because we took the position against Trojan Horse of defending the Islamophobic attack on Muslims in the schools and so on, actually makes it easier for us to be principled and to be seen that we are opposing all forms of oppression. We're opposing Islamophobia. We're also opposing homophobia. That's something that requires a high level of political debate. It also requires political independence. It means that we judge our attitude towards any movement that has religion as any kind of part of it, not by the merits of the religion itself, but by the extent to which concretely their actions are taken forward or holding back the class struggle and the unity of the class. And it's that sort of argument and that sort of putting your politics into practice that really this Marxism Festival is all about developing.
Hello. Hi. I think one of the reasons why I think it's important to remember that religion is not just opium is that we're drawn into political activity with people who have religious beliefs, ostensibly for ostensibly different reasons. For example, in my area, Haringey, we had United Front activity with our local mosque against the Mohammed cartoon and subsequent instances of Islamophobia. Our reason being that we're internationalists and we're against Islamophobia. Their reason being that they're against blasphemy. Ostensibly completely different reasons. We were drawn into activity with churches against the war in Iraq. Our reason being that, aside from being human beings, we're internationalists. Their reason being because thou shalt not kill is one of the 10 Commandments. And likely, working with supporting refugees, us because of internationalism, they're Christians because of brotherly love. So I think I just wanted to point that out. And I have a question about that. It's a question referring to the past, but I think it's valid, on other stuff today. Is on that, the protest against the Mohammed cartoons, sorry, it was a long time ago, the Muslims wanted to have men and women marching separately. And, we had female comrades who, were saying, no, we can't have that, we're. And so my question being, how do you handle it when you have questions that come up like that? It's not really a principle, it's not really a question of principle, for example, as a non-Muslim, I don't wear a hijab, but when I go to do political stuff at the mosque, I do, because why not? It's their culture, and why not respect their culture? So that's my question.
I just will reiterate, keep it to 2 or 3 minutes. So we'll go to Red Best.
Okay, I was brought up an atheist, and I think I was brought up with a quite disrespectful attitude to religion. I was a bit, now we can see Richard Dawkins like that, just not understanding it and thinking I knew best. And that didn't, that change about how I now regard religion didn't really come from, I thought Sue was a very, very good talk about where it does come from, but mine didn't come from a Marxist analysis. It came from the children I taught, really, first. I taught in East London for years, and a lot of children were Muslim children, and just I learned really real respect for them, and through that really respect for what they felt about the world and how they behaved, and their parents, and then my colleagues as more people came through. But I have been caught up, I'm being caught up now in the discussion that Sue raised at the end. And because we have worked together now for a long time, and from people, maybe some people remember Respect from 2006 against the Iraq War, and Stand Up to Racism, there is, we are all together in a lot of battles. But I do worry about how to approach my brothers and sisters who are Muslim and Christian in this issue of equalities education. I fought for equalities education against the Thatcher government. Section 28 affected me in the classroom. And we fought it. And as Sue says, we're not going back. So the principal position, equalities education, but I do want some help really from maybe people in the audience as well as Sue about how we approach this discussion so that we understand, we respect people's religions and views, but we must have the principle of equalities education.
I thought your talk was really great and nuanced, but I was just wondering kind of what your thoughts were on the spiritual socialist tradition, so I'm thinking predominantly of like Christian socialism, people like Karl Barth talking about biblical figures like James the Just, and kind of if you think that's just sentimental rubbish or if you think there's something there.
And now can we go to the blue t-shirt in the second to last row?
I'll leave Sue to try and answer that because I can't. If there's a better way to kick off Marxism 2019 or a meeting with Aretha Franklin, I don't know. I don't know that there is. And if anyone else is speaking at Marxism, can try and slip that in. I won't have a go at you. Last year, unfortunately, I had to go to my aunt's funeral in Limerick in Ireland, and it was a full-on Catholic kind of deal and so on. And I went there with her daughter, my cousin, who's 65, and she said to me on the way, she said, now whatever you do, Pat, do not say, don't tell them that I'm here with Khai as my girlfriend and partner, right? 65 years old. Now, despite all the fantastic struggles that there have been in Ireland and the fantastic changes that there have been, there's still that kind of homophobia around. And I think that in terms of my own breaking from Catholicism at a kind of young age, mainly because, like, a maths teacher was a monk and tried to beat calculus into us, like that was kind of one of the reasons. But in terms of coming to the kind of position that Sue argued about, I think the Stop the War movement was incredibly important in terms of putting where Muslim women were right at the centre and right at the front of that struggle a number of years ago. And I think it's very important as well what Sue said about the what's happening in Birmingham. That's a community on the retreat. But also, when we see our side, when it's on the move, when it's going forward, like Sudan Revolution, like Stop the War, actually all things are possible in terms of linking up all sorts of impressed people.
So we move to the back.
Okay, thank you. Basically, I come from Birmingham, so we've seen the demonstrations outside the school, the protests outside the school, and it's very difficult, thing because, as a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and our party basically has a really brilliant tradition of fighting Islamophobia. Not only, with Tommy Robinson, if you see all the demonstrations all over the country that we organised, but also one of the schools in Anderton Park Lane School, the headmistress wanted to ban the hijab, and so we sided with the Muslim community to say this is absolutely wrong. Now this same school then now is basically having having protests outside the school, so it's a very thorny problem. But first of all, where we start from is we stand by the oppressed. So when Muslims were being attacked, we stood 100% behind with the oppressed and fought. But when it comes to a question of protests that are really organised by conservative Muslims, they're not necessarily the parents. They're telling the parents lies about what's going on in the schools, and this is what's so heartbreaking. And basically, but we have to fight oppression wherever we see it, from the top of society and from the bottom. So we've got to be clear to stand with the teachers, with the school, and say the equality programme is absolutely right. And we think that it's really important to be clear and open about that. Now we have friends though, that have been working with fighting Islamophobia, and I think really it takes friends to sit down with our other friends, with Muslims that know that we fight, on their behalf when they're attacked. It takes friends sometimes to have those hard arguments, because if you don't have them, you are allowing the right wing, and it is the right wing because you've got Christian fundamentalists going down to those protests as well. So we've got to be clear. We've got to fight with for our friends. And also one last point. Sorry, I've said too much now, but it was the LGBT group that basically were talking about unity. They understood that they could use LGBT politics against the Muslims, and so they stood up and said, no, we're not going to allow that. It was LGBT banner against Islamophobia. They took that to the vigil on Christchurch. Birmingham Pride was led by LGBT plus against Islamophobia, and those sorts of arguments for unity is what we're trying to do.
Thanks. I just wanted really to talk a little bit more. I mean, people have come back on this and touched on it, and rightly so, but really the role religion plays, but also specifically around Islam, because when I first came across socialists and even Marxists, this is one of the first things I was told. It was when I was in college. And as somebody who grew up Muslim and feeling antagonised already in the society we live in, because of Islamophobia and so on, when I came across this argument that actually people who called themselves as, the champions of liberation and against oppression, that some people actually thought that religion is the problem in the world, and would look to, Charlie Hebdo also happened when I was in college. It was a big issue that, really before I could join anything or really start to be persuaded by anything, I needed to make sure that actually there wasn't this antagonising idea of my religion. And it is true, a lot of the time people have the understanding of Marxism that just looks at the part of the quote that is, why is that happening? What, is it moving it around or... can people hear me if I just stand up like this? And I think, Sue touched on it a little bit, but one of the things that started to win me over actually was the history that, and the tradition that the Socialist Worker Party actually stands in, which is that set by the Bolsheviks in 1917, not the stuff that comes after really with the rise of Stalin, because in 1917, for me, jihad meant, and it literally translates to, a struggle, with regards to your faith. it's not what people sort of associate to it now, that it's always violence and blowing up things and so on. And the Bolsheviks are going into the Muslim regions of Russia, which were 10% of the empire at that time, and saying wage jihad against the Tsar. Relating, actually, the Tsar at that point oppressed this section of the population, took a lot of Islamic relics that were from the Caucasian regions and so on. There was a lot of religious restrictions on people's faith. And one of the first things that happened after the revolution in 1917 was people were allowed to set up Sharia courts alongside the Soviet courts. All sorts of religious freedoms were afforded, religious freedoms were afforded, and it's really a very different picture to what you're given about Marxism, particularly because people say, oh, well, the Bolsheviks hated religion because they went and destroyed churches. Actually, the question of power is quite important here, because the Orthodox Church in Russia was very much linked with the Tsarist administration and so on, owning much property and so on, and it was far more about that, whereas people being able to practice their faith, mosques and so on, were actually afforded more in the way of people being able to practice what they believed and so on, and that's really to do with the question of power. But really, to sum up my point, I mean, if people haven't seen the stall already, there's an article that's been in the International Socialism Journal called The Bolsheviks and Islam, which really runs through this history, and really I think I'm quite proud of the Socialist Worker Party and really reinforcing that tradition, especially at a time like now. Like, people are right to say that this is becoming incredibly contested, especially with the stuff around grooming gangs and so on. There's a lot more pressure to say we are for women's rights, we are for LGBT liberation, but we will not allow these things to be used to whip up hatred against Muslims. Actually, we need to be able to unite against all of these people. And really, I mean, Trump represents both homophobia, disgusting sexism, and Muslims, and really he's all of our enemy. And there's lots of people like him. That's all I wanted to say, really.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to, briefly talk about how, religion can also be used to give people, the strength for revolutionary fighting. And, I come from across the pond back in the States, and we've unfortunately been having a lot of mass shootings lately. And personally, dealing with two in particular, the Orlando shooting where they shot up a gay nightclub, and then the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting last fall, which I have family who went to that synagogue. So these, being a Jewish person, these incidents caused me a lot of despair and caused me a lot of what's the point in life, right? You're going to be targeted, a lot of very emotional distraughtness, and it was returning to synagogues and returning to Jewish and religious communities that gave me the strength to continue to get involved in activism and continue to fight for revolution. And I think right now, these past few days, Jewish resistance groups associated with If Not Now have been all across the eastern seaboard of the states shutting down ICE detention centers. And so I think it's important to also talk about how, that yes, religion, we need to support religion, but also we need to understand that religion plays a role that actually causes religious people to fight for socialism.
So thanks for all your contributions, and just going to fiddle around with this a little bit. I just want to come back on a few things. So. First of all, the question of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, well, actually not particularly Catholicism, because you also talked about evangelical Christians in America and so on, and the far right, actually can be quite contradictory around the question of, for example, LGBT politics. Because on the one hand, you have people like Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, who present themselves as standing up against the Islamic onslaught on behalf of Christianity. They're fighting some new crusade or something like that. And this, and you get this stuff about gender ideology that is also that the Pope has been writing about, by the way. It's always just taken up in quite a lot in quite a lot of Catholic countries, and you know, and a lot of that is very backward in terms of what it says about gay people, and it's also creating quite a hostile environment, you know, for gay people. On the other hand, you also sometimes get the far right saying, well, you know, it's these Muslims that are against gay people, but us, we stand up for gay people. This is actually what Tommy Robinson said, you know, during his campaign in the European elections. He didn't come out with loads of homophobic comments. Now, he's quite happy to go to Poland and march alongside Polish neo-Nazis. He'd be quite happy to see gay people sent to the death camps. So I don't have any kind of illusions at all in him as being a friend of gay people, but sometimes it's a little bit contradictory what they say. But again, this comes down to, you know, the social conditions and people being able to interpret and use things in different ways. On the question of schools and so on, you know, look, I think there are, and this also partly applies a little bit to the question of, you know, men and women demonstrating separately and so on. You know, there's a number of points to make about this. First of all, we should never treat any religion, but particularly when we, you know, because obviously we're talking about Muslims, we should not treat Muslims as if they're all one block, as if every Muslim has the same idea. Every Muslim must hate gay people. Every Muslim must oppress women. This is a load of old rubbish. It's racist, actually. You know, it denies independence of thought to people just because of their religion. This is ridiculous. And therefore, one of the first tasks is actually to say, well, what do the Muslim women say in this particular situation? You know, for example, in the question of Birmingham, it would be a complete disaster if it was white people over one side saying you must have LGBT religion and Muslims on the other side. That would be a disaster. But we know Muslims, we know LGBT Muslims, and we know Muslims who are willing to stand up for the rights of LGBT people. And therefore it's vital to work with those people and to separate people off. And actually one of the things that I would say on the question of education and on the question of gay oppression and so on, is I would talk about the issue of scapegoating. I would talk about how you know, gay people have in the past been made the scapegoats. We were blamed for AIDS. I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember that. You know, we were blamed for the spread of AIDS and so on. You know, and all sorts of evils, which, you know, led to the Section 28 and what happened in schools and so on. And by the way, when you talk about what's happening in Birmingham schools, it's not just a Muslim. It's not just that it's about Muslims. You know, the Labour MP, to his shame, has said, you know, the parents are right, that they should have the choice and so on. Actually, even the government, we shouldn't go, oh, this wonderful Tory government that's bringing in this wonderful legislation. It's not that wonderful, actually. They are very, you know, they've left the door open to people to opt out of this legislation. And we get people like Boris Johnson, our possible future Prime Minister, you should all boo at this stage, by the way, our possible future Prime Minister, boo, calling gay, you know, not only does he call Muslim women letterboxes and bank robbers, he calls gay men bum boys, you know, and actually it's not surprised there's an increase in attack on gay people as a result of that. So I would talk about how, you know, gay people have been made scapegoats for all the sins in society in the same way that Muslim people have been made scapegoats for all the sins in society. That actually racism is, you know, one of the key questions in society at the moment that we need to organise against, and that opening up divisions within our ranks between different oppressed groups that stop us from uniting against racism is actually disastrous for all of us. And, you know, you think about the Pastor Niemöller poem, you know, first they came for the trade unionists, I wasn't a trade unionist, then they came for the communists, and then, you know, you could rewrite it, couldn't you? They came for the gays, they came for the Muslims, and so on. You know, we need to talk about uniting against the real oppressor. And therefore, when it comes to every religion, looking at the question of the role concretely that is being played in each concrete situation by religion in order to judge your attitude, not towards the religion as a whole, but to in that particular situation, in order to judge your situation. I can see number 5 on my list of things to say when summing up, and I seem to have missed out number 4, so never mind. I want to just come back again. So people talked about the progressive nature of religion. I want to talk about this and then finish by talking about the party. I didn't get a chance to quote from Thomas Munzer, this 500-year-old priest. So I'm going to just give you a couple of things now that he said. The masters themselves are to blame that the poor man becomes their enemy. If they do not remove the causes of the upheaval, how can things go well in the long run? Oh dear sirs, how the Lord will smite these old pots with an iron rod. If I say so, I shall stir up the people, so be it. And then he says, all the world must suffer a big jolt. There will be such a game that the ungodly will be thrown off their seats and the downtrodden will rise. And this really is what we want to do, isn't it? We want to give the world a big jolt. We want to get rid of all oppression and racism and sexism and homophobia and so on. And we want to unite and fight back. The question then is, and by the way, just for those of you who came in late, this is the missing sentence at the top of this, which is actually the most important sentence, and they won't probably tell you in your classes, which is that religion is at one time an expression of real suffering and a protest against that suffering, and it is the protest bit that we really are interested in, which brings me really to what people said about, I don't know a lot about the spiritual socialist tradition, but what I do think is that we judge people by what they do. By what do their actions lead to? I'll just mention briefly, for example, I suspect there are some similarities to the question of liberation theology in South America, where Catholicism became a means of motivating people against oppression. Our argument with the leaders of those movements is not about their religion. It's not about the rightness or wrongness of their religion. It is about, in practice, how do you fight? Because for Marxists, how do we fight? We see the world as divided into two opposing classes, largely, okay? And we see change coming through the class struggle. And therefore, anything which encourages division within the working class, within our side, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, on principle we defend, we oppose, and we stand with the oppressed. And we are fighting a class battle. The problem with people who use the language of religion largely to express their opposition is that rather than organising what we call a united front, where we organise people on a class basis to fight, they tend to organise people on a popular front, which will often include people who've actually got an interest in maintaining the current system, and therefore will ultimately make compromises. And that is our argument with people. And therefore people with all sorts of different religious faiths and beliefs are welcome to join the Socialist Workers' Party. Indeed, I would encourage you to do so. If you want to give the world a big jolt, if you want to rid the world of oppression and alienation, if you want to fight for a better society, free of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, free of wars, free of climate change, for Christ's sake. We shouldn't use that expression, should I? But anyway, if that's the world you want to fight for, then come and join us. Okay, but if at any point you find that your religious belief is getting in the way of those actions, that would be the point at which there was a problem. But we will not interrogate you about your religious beliefs if you want to join the SWP. We'll consider that a private matter as long as you are doing the right thing, arguing the right thing, and trying to forward the class struggle of the mass of the exploited against the exploiters. If you're prepared to come and do that with us, then you should join us.